When you think of Charles Bronson, images of steely-eyed determination and unshakable toughness probably come to mind. The man who became Hollywood's ultimate vigilante and death wish seemed like he could face down anything without flinching. His presence on screen was magnetic, commanding attention even when he spoke only a handful of words. That chiseled face, those piercing eyes, that unmistakable aura of danger barely contained beneath a calm surface made him the epitome of masculine strength in American cinema. But here's the thing about icons. They're still human. And Charles Bronson, for all his on-screen bravado, harbored some surprisingly mundane fears that might make you see him in a whole new light. The same man who portrayed vigilantes, gunslingers, and hardened criminals was scared of things that most of us deal with every single day without a second thought. These fears weren't just quirks or eccentricities. They were deep-seated anxieties that shaped how he lived his life, both in the public eye and behind closed doors.
So, Mr. Bronson, where were we?
Terrified, I think.
I think we were talking about the Malachi papers.
Getting permission to work in the city.
Before we dive into what scared this tough guy, let's talk about the name itself. Charles Bronson wasn't actually born Charles Bronson. His birth certificate read Charles Dennis Bukinski, a name he carried well into his acting career. If you look up his early film credits from the late 1940s and early 1950s, you'll see that very Lithuanian-sounding surname staring back at you. So why the change? Picture this. It's the 1950s. McCarthyism is casting a long shadow over Hollywood, and anyone with a foreign-sounding name that could be remotely associated with Eastern Europe is having a tough time landing roles. The House Un-American Activities Committee had everyone paranoid about communist infiltration, and a name like Bukinski definitely qualified as problematic. Studios were blacklisting actors left and right, and having a surname that sounded like it came from behind the Iron Curtain was basically career suicide. Enter Steve McQueen, who would become one of Bronson's closest friends in the industry. The story goes that the two were out for a drive one day when McQueen spotted a street sign that read, Bronson. Something about it struck him immediately. He turned to his friend and said it would make a perfect screen name. Strong, simple, unmistakably American. Charles agreed, and just like that, Charles Dennis Bukinski became Charles Bronson. Interestingly enough, name-changing ran in the family. His father, Balteris P. Bukinskis, had already Americanized his own name to Walter Bukinski years earlier when he first immigrated to the United States. The family understood that survival in America sometimes meant shedding parts of your identity, smoothing off the rough edges that marked you as foreign.
Sausage?
Now here's where things get really interesting. The man who played Paul Kersey, a character who roamed the streets of New York dealing out rough justice to muggers and criminals, was absolutely terrified of germs. We're not talking about a mild preference for cleanliness here. Bronson was so concerned about catching something from other people that he refused to shake hands with fans, ever, under any circumstances. Imagine being a devoted Charles Bronson admirer, the kind of person who's watched Death Wish multiple times, who can quote lines from The Magnificent Seven, who's followed his career for decades. You finally get the chance to meet your hero at a premiere or a public appearance. You approach him with your heart pounding, extend your hand for a handshake, and he politely but firmly declines. Most people interpreted this as arrogance or a diva attitude. They'd walk away disappointed, sometimes angry, telling their friends about how Charles Bronson was a jerk who wouldn't even shake their hand. The truth was far more mundane and frankly more human. He genuinely saw every outstretched hand as a potential carrier of microscopic nasties. In his mind, each handshake was a roll of the dice, a chance to contract some illness or infection. This wasn't a calculated decision to maintain mystique. It was pure, irrational fear. The kind of fear that grips you in your gut and won't let go no matter how much logic you throw at it. This wasn't his only phobia either. Bronson was also deeply afraid of fire. During the filming of Death Wish in 1974, when he was at the height of his fame, he made an unusual demand that puzzled the production team. He absolutely refused to stay in any hotel room above the second floor. His reasoning? If a fire broke out in the middle of the night, he wanted to make sure his family could escape. No matter how many people tried to reassure him about modern fire safety measures, sprinkler systems, or emergency exits, Bronson remained firm. Second floor or lower, no exceptions, no discussion. Think about that for a moment. Here's a man who portrayed characters who laughed in the face of danger, who walked into gunfights without hesitation, who seemed utterly fearless in the face of any threat. Yet he spent his nights worrying about fires and carried what was essentially hand sanitizer before it was fashionable. It's a reminder that the personas we see on screen are often miles away from the real person underneath.
I wonder if I could butcher's at that ring there.
That ring there, sir. That's a £1,000 ring, sir.
To understand where some of these anxieties came from, you need to look at Bronson's early life. Born on November 3, 1921, in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining town, he was the 11th of 15 children. Yes, 15. His parents, Lithuanian immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life, were instead grinding out an existence in one of the most dangerous and poorly paid industries imaginable. The poverty was crushing. There were times when young Charles had to wear his sister's hand-me-down dresses to school because there simply weren't any boys' clothes available for him. Try to picture that for a moment. A young boy walking to school in a dress while other children point and laugh. Can you imagine the humiliation he must have endured? That kind of childhood either breaks you completely or forges you into something incredibly resilient. In Bronson's case, it did both. At just 10 years old, he dropped out of school and went to work in the coal mines alongside his father. Most 10-year-olds today are worried about homework and video games. Bronson was descending into the earth each day, breathing in coal dust, working in conditions that would horrify modern labor inspectors. The mines were dark, dangerous places where men regularly died in cave-ins or from black lung disease. Here's where his smoking habit began, and it's worth dwelling on this because it would ultimately be what killed him. At the age of 9, even before he started working in the mines full-time, Bronson started using tobacco. For a 9-year-old boy wearing dresses to school and facing a future in the coal mines, tobacco might have seemed like a small bit of adult autonomy. Tragically, this early habit would come back to haunt him decades later. The tough guy who survived poverty, war, and Hollywood eventually succumbed to metastatic lung cancer on August 30, 2003, at the age of 81. Growing up in a Lithuanian-speaking household created another layer of challenge for young Charles. His family conversed entirely in Lithuanian at home, and many of the kids at his school didn't speak English either, so it wasn't initially a problem. But when Bronson taught himself English later on, without formal instruction, he developed a thick, heavy accent that never quite went away. This became particularly problematic when he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force during World War II. Fellow soldiers often assumed he was a foreigner, despite the fact that he was born and raised in Pennsylvania. The accent marked him as different, as other, even when he was serving his country and putting his life on the line. Despite these linguistic challenges, Bronson was actually quite gifted with languages. He became the first of the Bukinski siblings to graduate from high school. He was fluent not just in Lithuanian and English, but also in Russian and Greek. Not bad for a coal miner's son who started working before he hit puberty. At 22, Bronson left the coal mines behind and joined the U.S. Air Force. It must have felt like an escape from a life that had been predetermined since birth. He served as a member of the 760th Gunnery Training Squadron during World War II, and by 1945, he'd been promoted to aerial gunner on a Boeing B-29 Superfortress. As part of the Guam-based 61st Bombardment Squadron, he flew 25 missions against Japanese forces. War leaves marks on everyone who experiences it. Bronson received multiple wounds in combat, earning him a Purple Heart. The man who would later play tough guys on screen had actually lived through situations that would break most people. Perhaps that's why his performances felt so authentic. He knew what real danger looked like. He knew what real fear felt like. And he knew what it meant to push through both and do your job anyway. After the war, Bronson moved to New York City to pursue acting. Money was tight, so he shared an apartment with another struggling actor named Jack Klugman. You might know Klugman as Oscar Madison from The Odd Couple, one of television's most famous slobs. Ironically, according to Klugman's later recollections, Bronson was an excellent roommate and particularly skilled at ironing. The two remained friends throughout their lives. Bronson eventually moved out when he married his first wife, Harriet Tendler, in 1949. This marriage would last until 1965 and produce 2 children. It was during this first marriage that Bronson began to establish himself as a working actor, landing small roles in films and television shows.
And would you like a cup of tea too, mate?
Nothing closer to my heart than a good cup of British char.
Milk and sugar?
No, I like it dark.
Here's something that might surprise you. Charles Bronson became a major movie star in Europe long before America fully recognized his talent. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, he was grinding away in Hollywood, mostly landing supporting roles. Younger, more conventionally handsome actors were getting the leading man roles, while Bronson, with his craggy face and intense presence, was perpetually the sidekick. Then came 1968, and a French film called Adieu l'ami. The producer who approached him made an observation that resonated deeply with Bronson. In the American film industry, he said, everything was about conventional good looks. In Europe, particularly in France and Italy, everything was about character. Bronson, with his Slavic features, his weathered face, and his intense presence, had character in spades. The film was a massive hit, particularly in France, and it opened the door to one of the most iconic roles of his career, the harmonica-playing man seeking revenge in Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West. Leone absolutely loved working with Bronson, calling him one of the greatest actors he'd ever had the pleasure of directing. The film became a classic of the Western genre, regularly appearing on lists of the greatest Westerns ever made. In 1970, Bronson starred in Rider on the Rain, a French thriller that won him a Golden Globe. By this time, he was a certified superstar in Europe. He couldn't walk down the street in Paris without being recognized and swarmed. America was finally starting to take notice of what European audiences had known for years. When most people think of Charles Bronson today, they think of Paul Kersey, the architect-turned-vigilante from Death Wish. The 1974 film was controversial from the moment it was released, sparking heated debates about violence, vigilantism, and urban crime. The film was incredibly successful, earning $22 million at the box office and spawning 4 sequels over the next 20 years. Bronson was 52 years old when he took on the role, an age when many actors are worried about being put out to pasture. Instead, he was about to become one of the biggest action stars in the world, proving that age and conventional handsomeness weren't necessary for box office success. Here's a fun bit of trivia. Bronson wasn't the first choice for the role. Director Michael Winner originally wanted Henry Fonda for the part. When Fonda read the script, he called it repulsive and turned it down flat. Winner then approached Bronson, who had the opposite reaction. He loved the script and signed on almost immediately. The film tapped into something dark in the American psyche during the 1970s, a time when crime rates were soaring and many people felt increasingly unsafe in their own neighborhoods. Paul Kersey became an anti-hero for a generation, and Bronson's stoic, minimalist performance was perfect for the role. He didn't need long speeches or dramatic monologues to convey what Kersey was feeling. His face said everything. In 1962, Bronson met actress Jill Ireland at a time when both were married to other people. Ireland was married to actor David McCallum. According to Hollywood legend, Bronson told McCallum point-blank that he would eventually marry Jill. 6 years later, in 1968, that's exactly what happened. Bronson and Ireland married on October 5, 1968, and remained together until her death from breast cancer in 1990. Their relationship became one of Hollywood's great love stories. The couple lived in a lavish Bel Air mansion with their 7 children, a blended family from both of their previous marriages plus their daughter together, Zuleika, who was born in 1971. Bronson was devoted to his family in a way that might surprise people who only knew his tough guy image. He often insisted that Jill be cast as his leading lady, and the two appeared in 15 films together over the years. Beyond their Los Angeles home, the Bronsons maintained a farmhouse in West Windsor, Vermont, which they named Zuleika Farm after their daughter. In the late 1980s and through the mid-1990s, they also spent considerable time in Snowmass, Colorado. Bronson took his family with him on location shoots whenever possible, preferring to have them nearby rather than spending months apart. He'd arrange for private tutors for the children rather than leave them behind in Los Angeles. This commitment to family showed a side of Bronson that audiences rarely saw. Many film critics and journalists who interviewed Bronson over the years noted that he was remarkably similar to the characters he played. He was a man of few words, intensely private, and seemingly uncomfortable with the trappings of fame. In 1973, a newspaper profile described him as so introverted that he found it difficult to watch his own films or give interviews. Film critic Roger Ebert, who profiled Bronson in 1974 at the height of his Death Wish fame, observed that the actor seemed to genuinely prefer his own thoughts to conversation. Bronson told Ebert that he didn't particularly enjoy talking and found his own internal world more interesting than most discussions. This wasn't misanthropy or rudeness, it was simply who he was. Some people are naturally extroverted, energized by social interaction and conversation. Others are deeply introverted, finding such interactions draining. Bronson was firmly in the latter category, and the demands of fame must have been exhausting for him. Many critics and psychologists have suggested that his reserved nature stemmed directly from his traumatic childhood. Years of poverty, deprivation, and hard labor had taught him to keep his emotions locked down tight. There was also likely an element of cultural influence. Lithuanian immigrant communities tended to value stoicism and hard work over emotional expressiveness.
Will you marry me?
Are you serious?
Yes, I'm serious.
The 1990s were difficult years for Bronson. Jill Ireland died in 1990 after a long battle with breast cancer, and her death devastated him. They'd been together for over 2 decades, and losing her left a hole in his life that never really filled. He continued to work, appearing in several more Death Wish sequels and various television movies, but the fire seemed to have gone out of him. In 1998, at the age of 76, Bronson married for a 3rd time, to Kim Weeks, who had been his longtime companion after Jill's death. By this point, his health was declining. The years of smoking were catching up with him. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and despite treatment, the disease progressed steadily. Charles Bronson died on August 30, 2003, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 81 years old. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure secondary to metastatic lung cancer. All of it traceable back to decades of smoking that began when he was just a child trying to cope with impossible circumstances.
It's interesting. I have a feeling you're a man of great contradictions, because I know you paint, which is a fairly placid activity, I suppose, compared to some of the things.
Placid, not for me, Christ.
What made Bronson so compelling on screen was authenticity. He'd lived through genuine hardship and danger. He knew what it meant to be afraid, to be desperate, to fight for survival. When he played tough guys, it wasn't method acting. He was drawing on a lifetime of experiences that had forged him into exactly the kind of person who could convey strength with just a look. But he was also deeply, fundamentally human. He was afraid of germs and fire, phobias that might seem irrational but were very real to him. He struggled with the trauma of his childhood throughout his entire life, carrying those wounds from the coal mines and the poverty, even when he was living in a Bel Air mansion. He was introverted and uncomfortable with fame, despite achieving it on a massive scale. These contradictions don't diminish his legacy, they enhance it. Charles Bronson's story is ultimately one of transformation against incredible odds. A poor Lithuanian-American kid from the coal mines of Pennsylvania, who wore dresses to school and started smoking at 9, reinvented himself completely. He survived a world war, conquered Hollywood, even if Europe got there first, and became an icon of masculine strength on screen. But he never quite escaped the shadows of his past, and those shadows gave him both his greatest strengths and his deepest fears. The next time you watch Death Wish or Once Upon a Time in the West, remember the man behind the persona, the guy refusing to shake hands with anyone because of germs, The one sleeping on the second floor because of his fear of fire. The one speaking in that distinctive accent he learned on his own as a child. Charles Bronson was tough precisely because he knew what it meant to be vulnerable. He'd experienced poverty, war, rejection, and loss. And maybe that's what made him so believable, so compelling, and ultimately so unforgettable. His strength came not from never being afraid, but from moving forward despite being terrified.